Hey everybody, what is gospel generosity? I want to take a few minutes and answer that question from the scriptures. And there's just so much, over the years that we get taught in this kind of institution of the church and throughout history, biblically speaking, and in the world. And I want to make sure that, we have a clear understanding of what does it mean, tithe, offering, or this thing called generosity, and how does the gospel actually kind of fuel that for us, and fuel that in us, and fuel that among us. And I want to draw your attention to Colossians chapter 2, verse 17. And Paul says that ultimately the law was but a shadow pointing to what was to come, for the reality of it all, or the substance of it all, the fulfillment, if you want to take Jesus' words for it, of it all was Jesus Christ. Which means that the entire law in and of itself and all of its demands were completely satisfied and fulfilled in Jesus. Yes, that's even all the laws on tithes and offerings. That's so crazy. So before I jump into the gospel generosity kind of theology of how does this work, and then how does it flush out for you and me and our families, and then our local family here as a church at City of Joy, I just want to give a brief biblical history of the tithe and offering, and then we're going to get into how Jesus satisfied it real quick, and then what it means for us right here, right now, for the local church. All right? You ready? Here we go. A brief history, okay? Did you know that the first tithe, which is really like a tenth of something, do you know that happened? Abraham was the first tither, if you will, and he tithed, gave a tenth of all that he had to Melchizedek, who was a priest at the time, and he was like a priest. It's a priest of righteousness is what it means. He gave a tenth to Melchizedek, as was custom to the Near East regions. Okay, so it was, step back. So this whole tithing concept was really like this was what happened over there in the Near East, Middle East region of the time. God didn't demand it, institute it, or any of that. It was like, hey, I've got an excess, I've got an influx, I'm giving a tenth to you. We received this from, Sodom and Gomorrah and all the enemies, and we're giving a tenth to you, Genesis 14:20. But then we move forward, and you got Moses, right? You got the Mosaic law in Numbers 18:21 through 24. I'm going to give some references. Feel free to check them out for yourself. I'm just going to summarize them for us just to keep this short. You got Deuteronomy 12:5 through 6, 12, 11, 17, and then chapter 14 of Deuteronomy, verse 22 through 26. The Mosaic law just kind of encompasses all of that. And here's what I have summarized. He basically institutes, God does through Moses as he's given him the law. And he says, here you go, you're going to institute a tenth to be given of cattle and grain and such to the priests for their services to the temple of God, while later on, God would allow it to become something that is of monetary value given to the temple for the priests and their service. That's the Mosaic law. Years go by, I believe this is pre-captivity. Hezekiah reforms it, right? I just put down Hezekiah reform. You can go check that out in 2 Chronicles 31. Really, it's the first, you want the context, it's the first 6 verses of 2 Chronicles 31. And Hezekiah reforms and basically points the people's eyes. This is the beautiful piece. He points the people's eyes to God and his goodness in all of his law revealed. And then he follows it with the people responded with faith and trusted what God was saying to them and what he was revealing to them. And they responded with faith. They responded with joy and radical generosity. It's amazing. It's amazing. Nehemiah, realignment would be the next place in history. Nehemiah 10, 32 through 37, 12, 43 through 44. Nehemiah just realigns. Same thing like Hezekiah. It was a Nehemiah realignment after captivity, and he gets them back. Eyes on the Lord, eyes on what he says, eyes on who he is, and it's captivated them so much that they're filled with faith, filled with joy, filled with radical generosity. You've got the prophetic teachings in Amos 4:4 and Malachi 3:10, and there's several others where they enforce tithing in a sense, and they enforce tithing. And it said, well, really, if you're not giving unto the Lord as the law says, well, you might even be robbing God. That's what they said. If you jump into Jesus's day, the religious people of the day, now here's the thing, right? This is the linchpin as it moves into Jesus's day. The religious, let's just call them the priests and pastors of the day, that Jesus was here on earth. Well, they kind of picked up on that whole robbing God mentality, and they, let's just say they ran with it, and they. You can check this out in Matthew 23:23, and then some fuller context, Mark 12:38 through 44. And they basically demanded tithing regardless of what you have, at cost to the heart action of mercy and love and grace and justice and compassion and benevolence toward the least of these. Namely, in the context of Mark, is the widow, is the widow. And what a sad day that was. And Jesus is sitting there and he's giving his disciples a lesson. He says, beware of the Pharisees and the religious priests and people, the leaders of the day who are just pontificating in the square and praying just so that they can get noticed. And he says, come with me to the treasury in the temple, and I want you to witness something. And you've got all of the, you got the big wigs that are bringing big checks, and then you've got the widow who's bringing her last 2 cents, right? Just to put it simply, she's bringing her last 2 coins. Jesus is saying she gave out of really her poverty. They gave out of their wealth. And he's saying to them, beware of the Pharisees. It's a warning. See, when the religious people barrel down upon God's people with burden and law and demands, it actually burdens the people instead of liberates them. And so this lady was widowed, and she was burdened by, I have to bring, and even if I can't eat, I got to bring it. And well, that moves me into the church through the ages, sadly, has followed suit with this religious leaders of Jesus' day mentality on tithes and offerings and such. Give to the church, it's giving to God, and you're going to be blessed and highly favored. Hallelujah. Give to the church, it's giving to God, and if you give to the church, you give to God, and you're not disobeying. Good, good for you. I would just conclude it's simply gospel-less. It's actually guilt-driven, burden-infused generosity that seeks to further burden God's people rather than fan the flames of freedom and joy in the gospel. So that leads me to the gospel. That leads me to, so how did Jesus really satisfy it? And is there any hope here? And I just put this down as the next heading: Jesus, our tithe and offering. Okay? See, Jesus wasn't praising the widow's generosity in Mark chapter 12. Inasmuch as, like I was saying, he was rebuking the rich religious professionals' idea of tithing. They were stealing from the poor to line their pockets, burdening the people, and ultimately damning themselves. See, if you don't give, you're robbing God, right? That's how they picked up on that last line in Amos and Malachi and all of that stuff, and they ran with it, and they actually didn't listen to Jesus' teaching at all. Sadly, that's the phrase still heralded amongst the church, but here's the great news. Here's the great news. Jesus was the Father's full tithe given. Isn't that such good news? He was the fullness of heaven's treasure given, the first fruits of the Father given, so that we would possess everything He possesses and would lack nothing. That's freedom. That's grace. That's true joy-filledness. Jesus was the final sacrificial offering. He was the Lamb of God. He was the tithe of heaven, who was put in the offering plate of God. And it was accepted once for all, right? And we know that because the tomb was empty. The check of his life cleared. We are free. Jesus was and is and will forever be our substance, our tithe, our offering. Isn't that awesome? It's just good news. That's really good news. Now, the question becomes, what's our response, right? What's our response? Generally speaking, I just want to say it's generosity. You can go check out Acts 2, 4, and 6. It's basically giving to the needs of one another. If somebody's hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. If they're in need, work to meet the need. See a need, meet a need, right? Galatians 5, verse 6 says, because in Jesus we already have and possess everything that we need, we are free to give with no strings attached. Our time, our talent, our treasure, our fill in the blank. But if you want specifics, right, you want specifically speaking, here's the deal. Generosity, and you can look these up, 1 Corinthians 9, all of it, and 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, where I just want to give this to you. Paul simply in chapter 8 says that the people of Macedonia gave with joy to the needs of the saints locally and abroad out of their means and some, right? That's verse 2 through 3 in chapter 8. And they gave out of their means and some, and they gave of their own accord. They weren't coerced or begged, but they were compelled to do such a thing by grace. They were begging. They weren't begged to, but they then were begging because God was everything to them in their present poverty, if you will. He was the compelling power and draw for them to beg, Paul, how can we take part in caring for the needs of the saints? And they did this first, giving themselves to the Lord's will, right? Faith in Jesus, who's my everything. Therefore, I lack nothing, and I'm free to give anything I have. Generosity available to all. And then they also gave themselves to Paul and his team in the local church. And so Paul here urges the Corinthians, through Titus, to follow the example of the Macedonians. Don't you love that? And excel in this act of grace as well. That's verse 6 through 8. In their readiness and in their abundance, he says, give to the needs and watch how God displays his sovereign care and provision for his body in a reciprocating effort. In effect. Therefore, he concludes this, that each one should decide in his or her own heart what to give to the needs of the saints locally and do it. That's it. That's all he says. And as we look at some of the needs of the saints that would have been met, we find three buckets. You find benevolence, you find the operations, and you find the gospel ministers. And to just be blunt, this is how we've simply structured our budget as a family here at City of Joy. We've got the operational things that are needed to put some services online. You got licensees and all that other things. You got operational costs. And they're very minimal, but they're there. And we've just said operations. That's biblical. We want to be that. And It's benevolence, care for the needs of the saints. Somebody can't get X, Y, Z. We're looking to meet that need. And there's a whole process of all of that is helpful, that's holistic, that's blessing. But here's the deal. It's operations, it's benevolent, and then gospel ministers. Those who, live off of the gospel. And those whom God's called. And we kind of put under there, that'd be the staff that God's called here. Pastors and other staff roles and responsibilities that God has called to say, you're going to step into this. And it's going to make sense for the body here. So operations, benevolence, and gospel ministers. So what then for you and your family? I just want to make it simple. Eyes on Jesus as your tithe, right? Eyes on Jesus as your tithe. Don't stop looking at him as the complete, perfect, forever tithe given by God the Father for you. Eyes on Jesus. And let that move you to 2, a heart engaged in his mission. A heart that's just engaged in his mission, which leads to 3, joy to freely decide what you're going to give, how you're going to minister on the mission, right? Where are the needs? I want to meet the needs. What's the need of this family here? I want to meet the needs of this family here, right? And you figure it out. Nobody's coercing you, or nobody's threatening you, nobody's burdening you, nobody's guilting you. For the gospel fuels you, grace fuels you, and that in generosity is a grace. And then this, walk in faith, looking for other ways to bend out divine generosity that's been deposited in you by grace through faith in Jesus. I hope this helps understand a little bit of what is gospel generosity here in the scriptures, fulfilled in Jesus, and how it flushes itself out here at City of Joy Church.